You are listening to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Anand Nandkumar, Associate Professor of Strategy and Executive Director of the Srini Raju Center for IT and the Network Economy at the Indian School of Business, as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. In addition, Dr. Nandkumar holds the position of Associate Dean at the Center for Learning and Teaching Excellence at ISB Hyderabad. Dr. Anand's research lies at the intersection of industrial organization, the economics of technological change and strategy, with a particular focus on high technology sectors such as pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, and software. His work examines two broad themes: innovation and entrepreneurship. In the innovation stream, he studied how stronger intellectual property rights influence long-term incentive for innovation and shape the functioning of market for technology. And in the entrepreneurship stream, his current research explores the role of venture capitalists in driving entrepreneurial performance. Dr. Nandkumar earned his PhD in Public Policy and Management, Strategy and Entrepreneurship from Carnegie Mellon University. Before his doctoral studies, he gained industry experience working for 3 years at Silicon Valley startup and earlier in New York City with one of the world's largest financial services firms. At ISB, he teaches strategy innovation management and strategic challenges for innovation-based startups, blending academic rigor with insights from practice. In this episode, Dr. Anand Nandkumar dwells into his research, balancing allocative and dynamic efficiency with redundant R&D allocation, the role of organizational proximity and centralization, offering insights into how organizational design influences innovation outcomes and efficiency in research and development. With great excitement, we welcome Dr. Anand Nandkumar to today's podcast conversation. Professor Anand, thank you for graciously accepting our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to have you with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Professor, your research highlights a tension between allocative efficiency and dynamic efficiency in R&D. Could you explain how these two forms of efficiency differ and why striking a balance between them is particularly critical in technology-intensive industries?
Yeah, before I start talking about the balance between these two, let me back up and answer what we mean by allocative efficiency and dynamic efficiency. So any firm not only requires to survive today, but they also need to survive in the future, right? So if you're a strategist trying to come up with a strategy for a firm, your goal is to survive as long as you can. And that means that you have to balance the current with the future. Because if you get the current wrong, you may not be around to see the future. And if so, and hence only being future focused could be a folly as well. And on the other hand, if you only focus on the current, maybe the future becomes a bit murky because there could be lots of competitors that you need to deal with in the future who are coming up with new technologies. So this brings us to this idea of allocative efficiency. So one of the big tasks when it comes down to R&D is also to minimize wastage, right? Because wastage is expensive, it's monetarily costly, and if you splurge, let's say, money on R&D, your current finances are going to look bad and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, if you don't do enough to create value in the future, you're also putting your firm at risk, right? So this is the idea of dynamic efficiency. Allocative efficiency means that you're allocating resources for R&D without ensuring that there is not a significant amount of wastage, but at the same time, you're setting yourself up for creating value in the future, right? Which is this idea of dynamic efficiency. And this idea of balancing allocative efficiency and dynamic efficiency comes from this classic trade-off that managers typically end up facing, which is about how do I balance the short term with the long term, right? And there are different manifestations of that in the literature, which is about how do I explore versus exploit, right? Exploit is something that enables you to create value in the short term. Maybe exploration is something that enables you to create value in the long term. But then we are talking about a resource allocation decision over here, which is why instead of calling it exploration, exploitation, and the balance between exploration and exploitation, we are talking about the balance between allocative efficiency, which is about trying to minimize wastage in the current and trying to ensure that you're still able to create value in the future, which is dynamic efficiency, right? So that is the balance between allocative and dynamic efficiency that we are talking about. Now to the balance, right? The balance essentially flows from this idea of trying to balance the short term versus the long term. So it's not only important to be dynamically efficient to be able to create value in the future, but you can't give up your current. So you can't splurge money and you're wasting money on R&D, and maybe you will not, because you're doing that, you may not even be around to see the fruits of all the nice things, the nifty technologies that you're generating in the future as well. So this is the balance that we are actually talking about.
Very insightful. Professor, your empirical settings is large pharmaceutical firms. What unique features of pharma R&D made it an ideal context for testing these ideas, and how might result differ in, say, consumer tech?
So the point is that R&D pharmaceutical business is a business of science, right? It gets you as close to an industry whose the especially the discovery-based pharmaceutical companies like the Pfizer's, the Merck's of the world. These are all companies which are in the business of science, right? So if they really want to succeed, not just today, but also in the future, it depends on drug discovery. And drug discovery, as you know, and as you might have read about, the idea of coming up with one single molecule or the pill that we consume the bedside might require thousands of trials. Typically, it's about roughly about 10,000. So you need to try about 10,000 molecules before you zero in on that one single drug, right? So arguably, it's the closest to this business of science that we can get down to. But having said all of that, arguably pharmaceuticals is an extreme example in which this balance between allocative and dynamic efficiency matters the most. But that isn't to say that this doesn't apply to other industries as well. So some of these, so I think it universally, in my opinion, applies to most firms who are trying to toggle this idea of how do I, sort of balance the short term with the long term, right? And if you take it from that perspective, right? So this balance between dynamic and allocative efficiency, I think it's a universal problem that applies to most industries. And of course, it's so to in some industries, especially in those in which technology is the source of not only short-term competitive advantage, but also competitive advantage in the long run, it obviously this balance becomes more important than in industries which are not as fast-paced or dynamic and the like, or in which technology need not be the source of competitive advantage.
Dr. Anand, redundant allocation of resources is often seen as wasteful. Yet your study suggests it can be actually drive innovation. What are some of the ways in which redundancy stimulates valuable outcomes, and when might the cost outweigh the benefits?
So before I talk about that, right? So I want to give you a bit of a context, right? So in large corporations, there are different units that pursue R&D, and these different units are essentially lobby for a charter. So what do we mean by a charter? It's essentially the right to pursue a particular kind of innovation. So let's say I run a large pharmaceutical firm, and and let's say you are a unit, you'll have to engage in some kind of bargaining, or there has to be some exercise of authority from the top to say that, okay, look, Deepak, you can actually pursue some research in cardiovascular drugs or neurology and the like, right? So this is the context in which we situate the firm, and this is probably true of very large firms whose R&D is spread across geographies, multiple units, and the like, right? The issue is that here you have a situation in which it is quite plausible that multiple units can actually lobby for the right to pursue a particular kind of R&D, right? So there is this inevitable sort of charter allocation that either flows from negotiation or from a centralized authority, right? In that setting, you can quite imagine what happens when there is essentially this redundant allocation. So what do we mean by redundant allocation of resources? You essentially allocate the right to pursue a particular kind of R&D to two different divisions. right? If you have, so we talk about the example of COVID vaccine. There could be different ways of coming up with a COVID vaccine. You essentially tell two units, if you are Pfizer, that look, there are these two different units that have been tasked with developing a vaccine for COVID. So this would be an exercise of authority that confers this charter of inventing a vaccine for COVID on two different units. So in this kind of setting, these two units are essentially competing for two things. One, of course, they're competing for success. And success is also dynamic in the sense that if you succeed, you might be able to keep the charter, the right to pursue the same kinds of innovations in the future as well. So this internal competition means that firms are essentially going to vie different ways, or they're going to compete with each other to create more value. And here we are talking about not just value to the world, we are talking about value to the firm. And because of this idea of using authority to allocate charter, and because of the tendency of these units to sort of be in the good books of the authority who assigns them charters in the first place, they are going to not only produce more value, but they're also going to produce more value that is firm specific. Right. And this competition means that so I somehow set up a tournament within the firm. The idea of redundantly allocating these charters essentially sets up a tournament. And because of this dynamic part, right, in which, if I win today, I have some guarantee that I'll be able to do the same thing tomorrow as a unit, means that this also sets up a mechanism by which this kind of competition or tournament ends up makes these units contribute more firm specific value, not just value per se. And as a result of which this benefits the firm, right? And that is how maybe redundant allocation of resources, while yes, it is wasteful, right? If you think about it, it is wasteful because the same charter is being assigned to two different units, but it also ends up creating not just value to the world, but value that the firms can appropriate from.
Professor, you found that organizational proximity reduces project terminations while increasing innovation output. Could you unpack how proximity between units changes the dynamics of competition and collaboration in R&D?
So even before we talk about the effect of organizational proximity, it might be worthwhile to think about what does organizational proximity essentially do, right? So let's say there are different ways to measure proximity, and one of the ways to conceptualize proximity is geographical proximity, right? So I'm a unit. There is another headquarter. As a unit, I'm very close to the headquarters geographically, right? That's one way to conceptualize proximity. So there is this inevitable link between proximity and flow of information, right? So if I really know, and given my proximity, if I really know that the headquarters requires a particular kind of R&D, that information readily flows to me, as opposed to me being very distant, in which case the information is not readily available to me, right? So this essentially means that this idea of redundancy should essentially mean that I am more responsive. I conform more to the mandate of the central authority than is the case when I'm actually distant, right? So this essentially means that proximity essentially increases the firm-specific value of innovations that a proximate unit produces relative to the distant units. There is another fallout of proximity as well. Proximity might also measure influence, right? If I know somebody because of my geographical proximity, maybe there's a greater chance that I attend more meetings with the central organization. I'm a part of the same meetings. Maybe I have more informal networks. That means that given a chance that both of our projects succeed, right, with redundant allocation of resources, and we are competing for one of these projects to be retained, it's quite plausible that what wins the day could essentially be my influence as a proximate unit relative to a distant unit, right? So there is this dual phase of proximity, which is that I get more information. I also have more influence. which means that if I know what the central authority requires, my conformity is higher. But at the same time, my influence, my charm, or my informal networks means that these projects are also less likely to be abandoned, right? And given that there is a contest or a tournament between the two, maybe there's a greater chance that my project gets retained and my charter gets retained, right? So it's somewhat sort of the ideas or the setup is somewhat of a internal bargaining for property rights kind of a setup within a large multi-divisional R&D unit organization.
You cite examples like Pfizer's multiple COVID-19 vaccine candidates and Samsung's oil-lady rivalry. What do these cases reveal about strategic value of redundancy that theory alone can't capture?
So theoretically, right? So this idea of redundant allocation of resources. So if you talk to managers, there is this famous case of Apple and Lisa, for example, way back in the late 70s. This was a case in which there was this redundant allocation of R&D, and two different units were tasked with coming up with an operating system, right? So if you think about it from that perspective, this idea of redundant allocation has always existed, right? Sometimes by design, sometimes because there isn't great information flows within the organization for a variety of reasons that they have actually existed. The issue, of course, is that if you step back and if you think about not just R&D, how do you coordinate activities within a large firm? It either happens through authority or by allocation of property rights. So what do we mean by allocation of property rights? A particular unit is granted the ownership, and that ownership essentially motivates those kinds of units, right? So if you think about it from that perspective, this idea has not really been applied in an R&D setting. So the question that we are essentially asking this paper is that, how do you use the same idea of authority versus property rights in the context of R&D? Firms have actually been practicing this over a long period of time, and we are not just the only researchers who have spoken about it. So the literature essentially involved way back in the 90s, and it sort of paused before we picked up on this paper, right? So the firms have essentially been pursuing this idea for a very long time, but and they also, some of them also know the consequences. So what I would like to submit to you is that this idea of redundant reallocation, I mean, allocation of R&D resources is merely the starting point of thinking about how do R&D activities get coordinated in a multi-unit R&D setting, right? And there is a lot that we don't know that the managers somehow seem to have figured out through experience. But if you frame it, right, what is the big aha, or what is the big question that we need to think about that has implications not just for research but also for practice, is this idea of how do you fundamentally coordinate activities within a firm? Is it through the exercise of authority, right, which essentially flows top down, or is it by incentivizing to give them by giving them property rights? Right, I give you ownership. Maybe that motivates these units to strive for a breakthrough, right? So these issues of, we are barely beginning to scratch the surface, and these issues framed from this context, there are lots of dimensions and nuances to these issues, which is yet to be understood, but the managers seem to sort of know, and they seem to have figured it out from their past experiences.
Professor, redundancy leads to both higher value innovation and more project terminations. How should firms design governance mechanism to reduce waste while still encouraging breakthrough discoveries?
So I want to go back to the earlier question that you asked, right, which is about the balance between allocative and dynamic efficiency, right? If you frame it from the perspective of this balance, then the idea is firms actually need both, right? So clearly one of the prescriptions is not for firms to do one versus the other, but simply to think about when would one work better than the other, right? Under what conditions, under what environmental conditions. So here are two different ways to think about it, right? So in an environment in which there is great dynamism, there is a lot of threat from competitors, maybe prioritizing redundancy over allocative efficiency might be a great idea, right? So the classic example, of course, is that of COVID vaccine, right? So they were under the clock. Pfizer had to come up with COVID vaccine because of the pandemic. And given the potential catastrophic consequences of a lasting pandemic, they were under the clock. They had to really come up with a vaccine very soon. And Pfizer saw this opportunity and they said that, okay, look, if we are essentially, it's a story of who gets to the gate first, maybe, and speed is of the essence to go to the market, then maybe we need to prioritize redundancy, right? Overweight redundancy over allocative efficiency. But that need not apply to all firms, right? So if you think about startups, the startups are also facing the first battle, which is of cash flow, and then maybe the idea of long-term projects, right? So for them, the idea of trying to weight the future higher than the current might also have catastrophic consequences. So it's more a question of horses for courses, right? So how do you adjust your R&D strategy, or how do you adjust this balance between allocative and dynamic efficiency given your environmental conditions, rather than a clean prescription for all managers, no matter what the conditions are?
Professor, you employ NLP techniques to identify redundancy in patterns. How did this novel method advance your findings, and what potential does it hold for future strategy research?
So, even before I talk about it, I have to give you a background of what was the state of the art before we essentially did this, right? The state of the art before we did this was using patent classes. There are different kinds of patent classes. So every patent has a classification, and that's provided by the patent authority, either the US patent authority or the international, or there is an IPC classification, right? International Patent Classification. So the idea is that if a patent cites a particular class, it means that a patent is of a particular type. So researchers in the past have essentially used these classes to understand similarity. So if your firm and my firm patents in the same class, then maybe your patent is going to be very similar to that of mine. Over a period of time, there have been lots of deficiencies in these patent classifications, and as you can imagine, this any patent classification scheme is going to be redundant over time because technology is also evolving, right? So, and maybe it's quite plausible that the patent classification system does not move according to how fast technologies or the pace of technological change. So the NLP method goes beyond all of that, right? So what we do is we take the actual text of the patents, especially its description, the abstract, and to some extent the claims as well, and then we look at the similarity between the textual similarity between these patents. And this should overcome any biases that the patent classes based classification enforces on the data, right? So that's why I think we wanted to use these NLP techniques, because sometimes these classes can be inaccurate and add a lot of noise. And so this is how I believe we've advanced this method of comparing patents in the first place, well and beyond this idea of allocative and dynamic efficiency, which is simply an application of the same thing. And I think it has a lot of future potential for future strategy research. And to be sure, we are not the only ones to do it, right? There is a paper already in SMJ that essentially demonstrates the same method, except that we applied a different way to classify similarity, right? So I can get into these technical details if you would want me to, but it's not that these types of similarity actually matters. They might end up giving us the same results, but the idea of not relying on patent classes to measure similarity either between units within the same firm, and we use this idea of redundancy, and this is the method behind which we calculate redundancy. This we believe is a little more accurate than just a class-based classification.
The paper notes that unit and headquarter relationship shape outcomes. To what extent do soft factors like trust, informal network, or manager reputation matter compared to formal structures?
That's a great question, right? I don't think we talk about this in the paper. We sort of allude to it, but we don't talk about it in the paper. And our conversations with some of these R&D managers, to for us to get a nose on ground perspective, suggest that it's quite crucial. And I did speak about the informal networks, and we conceptualize as proximity. And this proximity need not just be geographical proximity like we measure in the paper. It can also be, sort of these informal networks and proximity in relationship between the managers in the headquarters, and the R&D unit themselves. So I think these, at a first blush, seems to be quite important. And of course, I think there is more work to be done there, right? So this is another area in which more work needs to be done, not only to understand the how the depth of these relationships actually matter for unit outcomes. I suspect they do, but it still needs to be tested and verified and maybe qualified as well. So there could be limitations to the extent to which these factors like trust, informal networks, and reputation actually matter.
Dr. Anand, if redundancy is a pathway to dynamic efficiency, what lessons can industries outside of pharma, such as AI, green energy, or semiconductors, draw from your study?
So I think firms, so more generally, right? I teach my students, and a lot of times I teach, I teach innovation to them, and a lot of times the discussions in the classroom goes towards, okay, look, why am I supposed to spend money on R&D? There is this tendency for a lot of us, right, me included, to think about having the difficulty to classify something as an investment versus an expense, because going to a restaurant is probably an expense, and investing in education is an investment because it pays off in the future, right? So if you think about it from that perspective, managers typically are tuned towards the current, and there are a variety of factors. There's a lot of work in strategy, finance, accounting literature that talks about the causes of short-termism of managers. And managers are, for a variety of reasons, or even for their career concerns, tend to be very short-term focused, right? They really don't think about dynamic efficiency, and more importantly, there isn't much of a thought they tend to give towards the firm's dynamic efficiency as well, right? So I think one lesson, even abstracting from this idea of allocative versus dynamic efficiency, is the idea that dynamic efficiency is important, and the fact that org design is important to determine whether the firm survives in the long run. So I just wanted to make that connection. And if one makes that connection, this idea of being able to balance the current versus the future has to be universally true across all industries, whether it's AI, green energy, semiconductors, and the like, right? So more than saying that is dynamic efficiency important for all kinds of industries, I would like to think that the balance between allocative and dynamic efficiency, I think, is universal, and it should be important in all industries. And to the extent that this balance between exploration and exploitation is a universal fact, the ability to allocate resources for the current versus the future also needs to be something that is that is universal across all industries.
Professor, my last question. If you were advising a senior R&D manager in a large pharmaceutical firm or any high-tech firm, what key takeaway from your research would you highlight to help them design resource allocation strategies that balance innovation with efficiency?
So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, right? In the following sense, I think there is, in general, a lot of thinking, right? So if you think about managing, say, let's say there's a manager that I'm talking to who's the chief research officer of a very large multi-unit organization. The fundamental story is that, okay, look, I think my firm has a bunch of strategic objectives over the next 4 or 5 years. how do I use my R&D units to cater to those kinds of strategic objectives? And that would essentially mean that, not only am I divvying up tasks between these different units, I also have to coordinate them and combine them in such a way that it essentially fulfills the strategic objectives that have been laid out by the company. So there is this general idea of how do I divide labor, how do I combine it, which and there are two big ways of doing it, right? We spoke about it a little bit. One is this idea of authority, right? So I can assign property rights to different units. I can assign charters to different units, and maybe I can do it in that particular way. The other way, of course, is that I can give them ownership, right? So I can say, if you win, you take it to the product, and maybe there's a winner take all context, right? So there, in general, I don't know if there is a systematic thought given to how, under what conditions can, activities, especially in the R&D area, can be coordinated using authority or by using ownership-like incentives, right? I think there is this. The general takeaway would be to carefully think about what are the consequences of these two different ways of coordinating R&D activities within a firm, and then to sit down and think that, okay, given my strategic objectives or the firm's strategic objectives, what do I think is more important, right? So how do I really rely on authority? Do I essentially rely on ownership-like incentives? Would be the conversation that I would begin with the chief research officer, and that would obviously have implications for the balance between allocative and dynamic efficiency for the firm. How good, a firm is at allocating resources for the current versus the future. Because if you think about it, there are, of course, these opportunity costs, right? If you draw a lot from the future and invest in today, your future is going to become bleaker. But on the contrary, if you only focus on the future, the probability that you're not going to be around to see the future is also going to be high, right? So that is sort of the delicate balance that we are talking about, and that would clearly depend on what the firm's strategic objectives are. And in order to achieve that, the extent to which managers use authority versus ownership-like incentives would be very crucial for balancing this idea of allocative and dynamic efficiency.
Listeners, we are truly grateful to Dr. Anand Nandkumar for joining us today and sharing his invaluable perspective on innovation, entrepreneurship, and the intricate balance between efficiency and creativity in R&D. His insights not only shed light on the academic rigor behind these themes, but also offer practical lessons for entrepreneurs, industry leaders, and policymakers navigating today's dynamic innovation landscape. Professor Anand, thank you once again for your time, generosity, and thoughtful leadership. It has been an honor to learn from your journey and research. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Deepak.